Welcome everybody. This is the first Spirituality, Theology and Health seminar of the new year, so lovely to have you all here, and a great pleasure to welcome Carolyn Blair from Queen's University Belfast. Carolyn and I first met in Edinburgh, I can't remember now, several years ago, but since then Carolyn arranged an excellent conference in Queen's University, which Harold Koenig and I both spoke at, and I heard tantalising glimpses about her PhD research, which I thought you would all like to hear more about, as indeed I would. So this is our chance to hear in some detail about what Carolyn's been doing. I can happily tell you that she has passed, subject to minor corrections. So Jenny especially will be envious, as will you. In fact, virtually everyone that's learned will be envious of you, because they'd like to be in that position too. But many congratulations from all of us. And you're speaking this evening, Carolyn, about caring for women with anorexia nervosa.
And bulimia.
And bulimia,
yeah.
eating disorders. Yes. So Carolyn, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you. Well, it's a privilege to be here, and thank yous for coming. And as Chris has said, it was lovely to have you last year over in sunny Belfast, as it was very sunny. Now, I wish you had put some sun on in Durham for me. So it was a delight and such a tremendous conference over in Belfast. So we're so thankful for that, and I'm honoured to be here, having recently got the PhD side of things. So I'm delighted at that, and I'm also in a privileged position that I am now a research fellow in Queen's, and studying or working on the area of trauma. So I'm evaluating a regional trauma network within Queen's University, alongside a few other research fellows as well. So as I say, it's a delight to be here. And just as a preliminary note as well, obviously you know I'm from Northern Ireland, but I have a rather strong dialect, and a lot of people would confuse me with being Scottish, so I'm just to clear that up, just in case you think, no, he's got to say he's from Northern Ireland. So no, I'm from Northern Ireland, but I have an Ulster Scots dialect. So if there's any pronunciation here today that I think, what is she saying? We can clear that up a bit later on. So yes, my area is caring for women with eating disorders, and for this in particular has been drawn from my thesis. So what I'm asking basically here is, could insights from feminist theology reform the practice of pastoral care? So I'm going to read this paper verbatim, and hopefully if there's any contributions you could make at the end of that, I would be absolutely delighted, and we can have a bit of further discussion. So this just another preliminary note. The research which I'm presenting has focused on the local church within Northern Ireland. However, this seminar aims to provide interdisciplinary evidence-based insights which are relevant to the universal church. Furthermore, that these insights from feminist theology may prompt reflection and aid deeper understanding of spirituality and the improvement of church-based pastoral care of women experiencing eating disorders. So, to commence, it's now apparent in the medical and psychological healthcare sector that certain forms of spirituality and religiosity improve mental health. The Royal College of Psychiatrists Special Interest Group in Spirituality is addressing this area in the UK. Yet the evidence-based reviewing the relationship between spirituality and eating disorders is still relatively limited. In Northern Ireland in particular, and Carlisle's evaluation of service user perceptions on spirituality confirms that while all service user participants express being aware of the role of spirituality within their experience of mental health, its exploration within mental health services was absent. Given that the conflict in Northern Ireland was and still is to a degree intertwined with religious orientation, this absence is understandable, yet there's still an urgent need for a particular focus on the potential for a positive relationship between spirituality and mental health in Northern Ireland specifically. So a brief overview of eating disorders. Eating disorders are significantly different from normal bodily dissatisfaction or general dieting, which is part of everyday life for many women. However, longitudinal research does indicate that bodily dissatisfaction, inadequate support, and the internalisation of a thin ideal are predictors of eating disorders. Nevertheless, understanding the shift from a normative measure of interest in dieting to a pathological concern remains incomplete. When eating disorders take root, the rigid inaccessibility that develops makes the sufferers notoriously difficult to reach. Consequently, there's an urgency to help the increasing number of individuals who are engaging in these life-threatening behaviours. As despite having received specialist treatment, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence confirmed the number of women who relapse is alarmingly high. Although there is a contention amongst specialists surrounding the core issues of eating disorders, there's unanimous agreement that eating disorders are serious illnesses. After a significant volume of research on modified cognitive behavioural therapy approaches to eating disorders, Cooper and Fairbairn found that they were repeatedly having poor treatment results despite their determined views that eating disorders are primarily cognitive in nature. Therefore, based on their clinical experience, they decided to include 4 additional factors which contribute to the initiation, perpetuation and maintenance of anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. Fairbairn, Cooper and Shafran now recognise the maintaining factors in 4 key areas: clinical perfectionism, core low self-esteem, mood intolerance and interpersonal difficulties. These processes form the bedrock of their transdiagnostic theory of eating disorders. However, despite the biologically based mental illness prototypes many women experiencing eating disorders exhibit negligible psychopathology. Steiker and Thaler explain that precise psychopathological traits are not necessarily prerequisites for the existence of eating disorders. Brewerton suggests that those who develop eating disorders can often experience pre-existing anxiety disorders, which can include post-traumatic stress disorder. Therefore, taking into consideration traumatic experiences is a vital contextual factor that shapes the course of eating disorders and culminates in an increased sensitivity to adversity and stress. As recommended by the most recent guidelines published by the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, the psychological treatment in adults for anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa, the 2 conditions in which this research is focused, is eating disorder focused cognitive behavioural therapy. For those primarily experiencing anorexia nervosa, the Maudsley anorexia nervosa treatment for adults, specialist supportive clinical management and eating disorder focused focal psychodynamic therapy are recommended. In addition to these, novel experimental treatments have been and are currently being trialled. Spirituality-based approaches will be discussed. Firstly, a definition of spirituality. In order to look at the relationship between spirituality and eating disorders, it's necessary first to define what spirituality is. This will be a definition you're all very well acquainted with. Cook defines spirituality as a distinctive, potentially creative and universal dimension of human experience, arising both within the inner subjective awareness of individuals and within communities, social groups and traditions. It may be experienced as relationship with that which is intimately inner, immanent and personal, within the self and others, and or as relationship with that which is wholly outer, transcendent and beyond the self. It's experienced as being of fundamental or ultimate importance and is thus concerned with matters of meaning and purpose in life, truth and values. In contrast to spirituality, religiosity is defined as a more extrinsic and institutionalised relationship with the sacred. Religion is usually defined in more terms of beliefs and practices in faith communities where systems are agreed and held in common. However, quite often spirituality and religiosity are defined synonymously, as intrinsic spirituality is often dependent on religion. Marsden et al. Postulate that religious beliefs such as the theological constructs of the illness have an impact on attitudes and motivation in eating disorders, so these cannot be ignored. Among many other factors, positive religious coping is characterised by a relationship with God based on a sense of spiritual connectedness with others, security and a belief that there is meaning and purpose in life. despite research confirming that women experiencing eating disorders are often distanced from their own sense of spirituality, spiritual interventions are rarely used in or as an adjunct to contemporary eating disorder treatment programs. Secondly, the relevant issue of the relevancy of spirituality and attachment to God. Contemporary research emphasises the value of a secure attachment to God as contributing positively to increased bodily satisfaction. Although preliminary findings appear positive, as already stated, there is a lack of specific research on eating disorders, religion and spirituality as documented in Bonell and Koenig's systematic evidence-based review. In response to this, Akrai et al. Conducted a small systematic review of 22 studies and found that a secure attachment to God was consistently correlated with lower levels of disordered eating. Stregner, Snicker and Felk suggest that if a woman has a secure base, this relationship is likely to help her to manage her emotions, and therefore she is unlikely to use maladaptive coping mechanisms in response to negative affect. In Holman and Lehman's study, an anxious attachment to God is associated with increased tendencies to engage in social comparison, which consequently caused an increase in eating disorder symptoms. Qualitative studies of recovered eating disorder clients have found that for many, spirituality has been crucial in their rehabilitation. Marsden, Kerrigan and Morgan. An intensive study of one client, a regulation of disordered behaviour was recorded to be linked to the resolution of distorted religious issues which were habitually misapplied to her life. In general, a secure attachment to God strengthens one's capacity to manage negative circumstances through meaningful relationships with God and others. Katie et al.'s metasynthesis of those with severe mental illness confirms that a secure attachment to God and positive sense of spirituality are positively correlated factors in recovery. When exploring the helpful and unhelpful aspects of religiosity on eating pathology and bodily satisfaction, Goulet et al. Found that placing greater importance on religion was associated with increased eating pathology in the lives of 168 adult females at a Catholic-affiliated university. Studies suggest that an anxious attachment to God causes high levels of shame coupled with fears of rejection, which contribute to eating disorder pathology. Holman explains that people who feel uncomfortable depending on God or who fear God's rejection have difficulty extending kindness to themselves. Avoidant and anxious methods of relating to God therefore contribute to adverse outcomes. It is clear that religious affiliation is not always helpful, especially when beliefs have become oppressive. But there is greater evidence to suggest that spirituality could be a valuable aid in recovery. When analysing the findings from multiple related studies, Durham et al. Explained that these studies indicated that individuals higher in spirituality and / religiosity were not as overwhelmed by negative emotions because religiosity provided comfort, support and hope in times of distress. Intrinsic religiosity is found to have a buffering relationship in decreasing the consequences of negative emotions and as a result can reduce eating disorder symptomology. Durham et al. Explain that affiliating as Christian was significantly negatively associated with eating disorder vulnerability. Marsden et al. Emphasised the importance of considering the religious and spiritual beliefs of those who experienced eating disorders, as these fixed constructs can have a significant impact on behaviour, attitudes and motivation. Some authors have theorised that those who experience eating disorders struggle with several core issues which derive from these unresolved spiritual issues. They posit that a treatment method that considers spirituality could be the most effective way to address these issues. So moving on to a brief overview of the research methodology for this study. Due to the complex and specialist nature of this study, a qualitative method was used in the research paradigm. As highlighted, there has been little empirical research into the variables of Christian spirituality and religiosity and the impact on eating disorders. With little evidence currently being reviewed from a Northern Ireland context, therefore, literature on the topic of the connection between religion, spirituality and eating disorders remains underdeveloped. Research into eating disorders thus remains a specialist area. Therefore, using a qualitative design has aided in the task of capturing the phenomenon in depth and gave the participants a voice to share their experiential knowledge and has subsequently provided insightful real-life perspectives. The sampling frames of this selection included 20 females who were over 18 and had experienced either anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, or both. 8 past or present carers of females who had experienced anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, or both, and 16 individuals who claimed insight into churches and mental health in Northern Ireland. When gathering this primary data, narratives of women with eating disorders were explored to help understand and make sense of their eating disorders in the context of religious experience. Carers' narratives were then explored to help further understand the concept of and difficulties associated with caring for women with eating disorders. Finally, narratives of those claiming insight into church communities were explored to help understand and make sense of church communities' understanding of and communication with those experiencing eating disorders. The primary data from these 3 groups was analysed using in vivo and thematic analysis. As the primary data from the interviews was analysed, and the secondary data from the literature reviews based on eating disorders, fundamentalism, pastoral care and feminist theology were synthesised, conclusions concerning the effectiveness of the communication and care between those experiencing eating disorders, church members and carers were drawn. For the purpose of this seminar, due to time limitations, it will present 4 key themes within this overall classification. These themes are not mutually exclusive either. Instead, the boundaries between them are permeable and in some cases overlap. So these core themes are vulnerability, power, embodiment and creativity. So firstly, we'll consider vulnerability. The majority of the women who were interviewed described feeling perpetually unsafe and persecuted by their thoughts. Therefore, their sensitivity to threat was often heightened, causing an emotional vulnerability. Furthermore, many of those interviewed experienced repeated traumatic events which had a significant impact on their capacity to trust themselves and others, which aided to their sense of vulnerability. Consequently, a lack of safety, insecurity and avoidant fear-based behaviour were common to the majority of the women who had experienced eating disorders. Feminist theologians consider that many traditional teachings on theological anthropology have perpetuated androcentric theological principles, and this distorted patriarchal vision of human nature has disempowered and subordinated women and thus amplified their vulnerability. In particular, many feminist theologians have expressed distress regarding the atonement model used by fundamentalist communities, which commends the divinely mandated suffering of an innocent victim and emphasise that it is a nefarious encouragement for abuse victims to accept their abuse as if it was God's will. As patriarchal theologies have alluded to the cross as an apex of sacrifice and suffering, feminist critiques argue that such interpretations and argue against such interpretations and deem this to be more akin to a patriarchal valorising of suffering. Christian theology requires divine human reconciliation, restoring the fracture caused by sin as a precondition for redemption. In patriarchal theology, the need for reconciliation is premised upon a fall for which Eve, a woman, is seen to be culpable. Murphy explains, so woman suffered from a double burden of guilt and shame, first for sharing the fallen human condition, secondly for being born as the weaker half. Feminist theology, however, helps individuals to reframe the perception of the salvic process through which the language of redemption can be redeemed. Feminist theologians most often view the atonement as advocating victimisation and a helpless vulnerability, therefore prompting the question that Gray asks, if the central symbol of Christianity contains with it a message that keeps women impaled on the cross with societal approval, what message of the resurrected hope and redemption can it bring? The value of the patriarchal interpretation of Christ's self-sacrifice and brutal degradation as a necessity for redemption puts the concept of salvation in question. Isherwood asks the question, is there anything for a saviour, male or not, to save us from? Although the concept of being saved from sin is formative in traditional Christologies, for feminist theologians their desire to turn the focus to humanity's innate goodness as image bearers of God and away from the need for the rescue from the sinfulness of one's own humanity. Raphael writes, the belief that one historic man, Jesus, could rescue all women from sin ignores the possibility that human and divine creativity together can co-create and transform the world. Hayward explains that the image of Jesus as rescuer hero must be reconsidered, as this further embeds the powerlessness and victimhood of humanity. Alternatively, by embodying a sense of erotic power where one is actively involved in the co-redemptive process, there is empowerment. Raphael explains feminist criticism insists that too much speculation about salvation has involved not only the repudiation of nature but also the repudiation of the erotic, that energetic engagement with life of the embodied self, where the union of sexuality and spirituality constitutes human well-being or wholeness. Therefore, in feminist thought, redemption becomes more focused on reclaiming an understanding of the innate goodness and the authentic heart of humanity, which has been confused by manipulative ideologies and social structures which have warranted the subordination of the vulnerable. Although it is essential to consider feminist theologians' thoughts on how the crucifixion narrative can be exegeted in a way that validates subordination and disempowerment, Moltmann Wendell suggests there is an issue with the depoliticization of the crucifixion, as what disappears is the violence of the death of Jesus as an act of the brutal power of the state. Furthermore, she notes that through nullifying the value of the cross, feminist theologians risk missing a crucial moment in salvation history and a moment of identification for all those who have felt abandoned. The dereliction of Jesus expressed in the cry, "Why have you forsaken me?" Nevertheless, given the ways in which the crucifixion narrative has been presented in patriarchal theologies, Moltmann Wendell suggests that it's not surprising that for many feminist theologians there's an outright rejection of the cross. She comments, the cross, as it is often preached, has often fatal consequences for women. Although feminist theologians understandably express difficulty with the atoning sacrifice and the forgiveness of sins, Moltmann Wendell advocates that by moving towards a life-giving theology of the cross, women's experiences can be honoured. Moltmann Wendell's defence of the value of the crucifixion narrative is further developed in the God-forsakenness of the cross and furthermore the astonishment of the woman who meet the resurrected Christ on the way to his tomb. Perhaps, as Moltmann Wendell suggests, feminist theologians could experience a sign of salvation that we can erect out of death and nothingness and transplant into new spheres in the dialect of the cross and resurrection. While Moltmann Wendell and Jones question the disregard of the cross in many feminist theologies, their emphasis is on the need to reflect upon the horror of the cross as a narrative of identification for those who have suffered immense trauma. Although feminist theologians depart from a traditional definition of sin, redemption and an otherworldly eschatological vision, their relational emphasis rightly amplifies the need to focus on the innate goodness of humanity and thus bring salvic hope in the present. When viewing redemption through a patriarchal lens, the relationship between humanity and God has been entirely broken through the sinfulness of humanity. Therefore, the human body in patriarchal theology is rejected, shameful, and viewed as the cause of the chasm, which has subsequent deleterious effects on how one relates to oneself. Gray explains that if one accepts that the interrelationality and mutuality and equality are at the heart of reality, at the heart of the great divine creative redemptive dynamicism, participating in this must be holiness. Sin must therefore be acting against the relational grain of living. As Christ exemplifies relational living and dying, the emphasis moves from the Christ as hero to Christ as human. Isherwood explains feminist redemption theories then move us away from the absolutes of some human/divine being having done it all, to an ongoing process that requires our full understanding and participation in the complex business of being human. This requires overcoming the myths of gender construction more than dealing with an inborn and innate ability to sin. As feminist theologians emphasise the relationality of Christ, theological justifications of patriarchy are dismantled, and egalitarian mutuality becomes the authentic meaning of original and redeemed creation. Reconciliation with a God and a renewed understanding of salvation can be more easily adopted. Isherwood explains we need to reconnect with our unfolding history of intimacy and empowerment. Intimacy is not possible without vulnerability, as personhood is inevitably linked to relationship. Being a person means not simply being oneself, but being in relationship to others. Therefore, how one views oneself has a distinct impact on how one is in relationship to others. Stemming from Hayward's thoughts on dunamis and erotic connection, this raw energy is truly embraced in open vulnerability and mutuality in relation with others. The divine incarnation and salvic power in human life must reside in loving connectedness and not in single individuals, as love resides in vulnerability. Brock explains, in exploring the depths of heart, we find incarnate in ourselves the divine reality of connection, of love. The heart's strength lies in its fragility. As those experiencing eating disorders accept and fully become aware of this possibility of interconnectedness through erotic power, this speaks to the commonly experienced issues of rejection, isolation and loneliness. Isherwood and Harris explain feminist theology has encouraged engagement with raw, radical incarnation and the vulnerability and bravery to feel and to touch, to understand Christian theology as a skin-on-skin activity, a face-to-face mutual engagement of ever fuller becoming. This perspective meets communities which endorse individualism through building walls with a challenge to embrace vulnerability and love in a more deep and meaningful way. By building a secure base, church communities can provide an optimum environment to cultivate erotic power, protection and safe boundaries. In this stable base, the individual who is in recovery should be free to test limits without fear of retribution, as the church community exercises unconditional love and acceptance. Therefore, a community environment that promotes erotic power through the interconnectedness has the potential to provide the optimum healing environment to cultivate a more secure sense of self. Second, we'll consider power. A disturbingly painful relationship with power is evidenced through the interviews with the woman who experienced eating disorders, as the majority felt resentful towards their propensity to be submissive and their desire to please others. Many of these women admitted to feeling disempowered, oppressed and trapped on a repeated basis. Moreover, religious institutions were often referred to as oppressive, patriarchal and judgmental. As these institutions appeared as the gatekeepers to God, this often paralysed the woman's capacity to have a personal relationship with God, and instead invoked fear. Therefore, due to these perceptions of power, there's little belief that residing in a religious institution could be conducive to recovery. If women in church are traditionally positioned as submissive within heteropatriarchal relationships that are its most fundamental structure, do women's sufferings in religious patriarchy have to be explored structurally in order to set free the emancipatory power of the Christian community? Chop explains, feminist theological reconstruction of Christian community can begin with birth, by asking how, within the words of woman, community is created in, with, and through the word in the reception of the scriptures and the reality of emancipatory transformation. Chop suggests that patriarchy is a web of sinful, destructive relationships of oppression. However, feminist theologians recognise that the ecclesia as the space where these structures of patriarchal oppression and sin can be analysed as well as denounced. When church community has unhealthy power dynamics, hierarchy becomes damaging, and oppression and marginalisation of the vulnerable are evident. As Keller reflects on the disempowerment of woman as part of Western society's patriarchal heritage, she affirms that in contemporary culture the empowerment of woman is of utmost importance. Graham's post-structural emphasis on social transformation represent the postmodern insights, as Callan and Miskey suggest that knowledge is rooted in particular standpoints and works best by first understanding and analysing the discourses and regimes of power in their own context. Pattison explains that a presentation of an all-powerful God may not be the most fitting image to present to one who is feeling deep shame. Therefore, although it remains true that for many a human response to God's omnipotence, omnipresence, and omniscience is comforting, for those experiencing intense guilt and fear, these divine characteristics can be experienced as oppressive. Meglemore explains, the emotions affect the quality of our interactions. Being able to discern emotions helps us to recognise contradictions and confusion and gain clarity about power relations. By becoming aware that the God of one's understanding is shaped by individual past experience of authority figures, it becomes possible to reframe the God image one has in mind. Furthermore, through recognising that God frees those who are imprisoned and is not an unfair judge, as Luke 4:18, Luke 18:1-8, refuge and comfort can then be found in the God image held in one's mind. As women who have experienced eating disorders reframe and recognise that God does not endorse oppressive patriarchal models of the church community, and these are not God's design for women, there's potential to regain trust in God and the church. Object relation theory helps us to understand the psychological mechanisms which decide how God is framed by an individual's preconceptions and experiences. As van der Kolk explains, the perpetrator who oppressed and abused is often internalised and becomes an inner tormentor. As Kilshed explains, the traumatised psyche becomes self-traumatising. Therefore, the healing process has to be navigated from within. Through understanding this internal oppression, the anguish of those who experience eating disorders can be grasped, bringing a deeper understanding as to why the prospect of intimacy with an all-powerful God could be daunting. Lewis suggests that there is an alternative response to God's omnipotence, omnipresence, and omniscience, and suggests that it is possible to move beyond fear to awe. He writes, now in passing from fear through awe to admiration and reverence, man advances from the state of a beggar asking for protection to that of a bestower of praises. The most obvious implication of awe-filled worship is a shift in focus away from the self and towards God, with a consequent motivation to help others. However, there's also notable psychological and physiological benefits which could aid in the liberation of those experiencing eating disorders. As one's fear reduces and there's an appreciation of the powerful, though not oppressive, nature of the divine creator, awe is inspired alongside a realisation of one's own power as made in the image of God. Furthermore, Jones explains that according to Calvin, Scripture is never just a book we quietly read. It is a dramatic world we are invited to stand within and inhabit as our own. A world where we encounter the God of Israel and Jesus Christ who creates and redeems the world. Therefore, as one reframes the vastness of the power of God influenced by a sense of awe and wonder, they become aware that there is an integral part of the theatre of the glory of God. Faber explains the integrity of relation of power in right relation recovers the infinite within human finitude, the interplay between transcendence and immanence, and movements of opening and closing, of drawing into oneself, and of empathetic crossing over to another person. Therefore, when one senses both the transcendence of God and the immanence of Christ, this is an invitation to experience intimacy and to be filled with an immense sense of being loved. The relational factor in the experience of awe is how we bring one another into being, Harrison explains, we do not yet have a moral theology which teaches us the awful, awesome truth that we have the power through acts of love or lovelessness, literally, to create one another. Hayward asks rhetorically, might the struggle for the possibility of relational mutuality be a primordial source for our authority? As power and vulnerability are inherently linked, Brock characterises the self's tendency to disassociate from emotions of vulnerability, anger and grief, when the power used by caregivers have not affirmed the appropriateness of these emotions. The dominance of this approach of power over those who are vulnerable causes a numbness, an inability to process painful emotions, and the splitting of owning and disowning emotions. Subsequently, fragmentation occurs. Brock compares this experience to patriarchal socialisation in the family, especially through fixed gender roles, and refers to the ravaged, faint, fearful, broken heart of those who have suffered under patriarchy, damaged and weakened from a state of original grace. Emphasising the importance of awakening these emotions through the senses, Rambo explains, restoring the sense of trust and meaning is not purely cognitive. It involves a different sense of the world instead. Sensing life is this kind of reconnecting process. It is an exercise of the imagination in the face of that which is unimaginable. When reconnecting to the world, assuring safety is the primary task in care. In accordance with Herman's emphasis on safety and Calvin's theological framework, Jones explains that in Christian context, the sovereignty of God can provide a profound sense of safety. She further explains, for persons whose world has been knocked out of kilter by traumatic events, the invocation of divine control can serve to stabilise their seemingly unstable reality by bringing order into the midst of profound disorder. With this stabilisation comes the possibility of imagining that one is, in the most ultimate sense, safe. Relinquishing one's control and trusting God would appear to be the ultimate sacrifice of self-agency and could be experienced as counterintuitive to recovery. However, trauma literature suggests otherwise, that this acts inversely and affects one's sense of personal agency. Reflecting on Calvin's instructions on the art of prayer, Jones explains that an initial step, he invokes the reality of God's sovereignty because this dimension of divine identity provides the traumatized with a profound sense of safety, which they are so strongly lack as they wander in the world of the dead. This hollow, emotionless existence is common to almost all those who experience trauma, and was described as numbness even in the face of circumstance which would certifiably rouse emotions. Building an image of a deity who has shown himself to experience the full range of human emotions is crucial to Christian pastoral care, when considering that for those who've experienced trauma, it's impossible to trust a fear-inducing, emotionally detached God. Instead, safety is found when unconditional love, stability, and empathy are sensed, as these characteristics are an integral part of God's nature, and that nature should be reflected and embodied in the Christian community. Hayward defines authority as dunamis, dynamic relational power, a power which each individual has within themselves. This authority is that which is dynamic and life-giving. In the Bible, it is that which leads to the fullness of life. In explaining the natural impulse of the body to resist domination and desire connection, and referring to those who have suffered abuse and addiction, Brock and Thistlethwaite suggest that the body's truth and compassion has a natural urge towards healing. However, it stands true that, whether internal or external to church communities, the critical first step towards recovery are centred on developing awareness and recognising how one relates to authoritative figures, whether that be cowering in submission, running in avoidance, or trying to destroy the dominant figure. By engaging with one's erotic power, vulnerability can thus translate as power, moving away from the rule-based, fearful living to awakening the senses as part of embodied living. Isherwood explains, Eros allows us to feel our deepest passions in all areas of life, and reclaim them from the narrow sexual definition used by patriarchy. This has profound consequences for patterns of leadership in church communities, as issues of power has the potential to become less focused on denouncing oppressive structures and more orientated towards claiming one's rightful sense of power in equal relationship to others. Theology is progressive in its definition of power in terms of a reciprocal transaction of influence as the flow of receptive power receives and agental power guides. When considering this use of one's erotic power, this interactive process can cultivate an authentic sense of intimacy and furthermore promotes an openness to communal embodiment through the ebb and flow of passionate relationships. Third, we'll consider embodiment. The experience of mind-body splitting is common to all interviewed who experience eating disorders. Furthermore, the varying degrees of disembodiment caused by splitting is epitomised by the self-objectification of almost all the women interviewed who experienced eating disorders. Feelings of self-hatred and attacks upon one's body exemplify the dissonance between body and mind. For many women experiencing eating disorders, the perfect body is desired and seen as a means by which she gains respect. Consequently, this externalisation results in objectification. Thus, their body does not feel like their own because it seems to be ruled by others around them as they adopt a habit of self-objectification in their efforts to attain culturally enforced ideals of beauty. An essential part of feminist theological anthropology is the area of body theology. Isherwood explains how so often our Christian heritage has been oppressive for women and made living in female bodies particularly difficult. It's difficult for women to be fully embodied under patriarchy. This has been an area which is underdeveloped and often neglected in traditional forms of theological anthropology. Isherwood and Harris explain that traditional Christian theology has been at the heart of disconnection by making people aliens in their own skin. By looking at the body as a site of liberation rather than imprisonment, Patterson contends that people need theologies that help affirm incarnate worldly experiences rather than to escape or deny it. To illustrate, in Jesus' encounters with woman, he advocated an incarnate non-dualistic anthropology for woman of all levels. Isherwood argues that what is extraordinary is the deeply embodied erotic nature of many of these encounters between woman and Christ. The road to salvation involves not the ditching of our sensuality, but the reintegration of our two natures, just as Christ unified his two natures in one person. Through women's bodies, the flesh needs to find voice and a form of language that has been suppressed in patriarchal Christian theology. Isherwood explains the flesh-made word enables us to find a voice and to make our desires known. As Hebrew anthropology is determinative for a Christian view of the self as made in the Imago Dei, then a strict dualism between body and soul is rejected, but the perspective of the embodied soul allows for a duality of human being without creating an opposition between body and soul. Isherwood explains, we have begun to hear the bodies of woman and to place them as word within our religious and theological reflections. We have cautiously and with much trepidation allowed the flesh to show us the divine rather than submit it to the divine moulding of the flesh. New possibilities for understanding the concept of embodiment are opened through realising the sacredness of flesh rather than the traditional view of flesh as sinful. Hayward explains that we must take our human experience seriously. We are left alone, untouched, until we choose to take ourselves, our humanity, more seriously than we have taken our God. Embodiment is a concept that encapsulates the message of the Bible and should not sit in contradistinction to the Bible. On the contrary, it should be rescued from the periphery of Christian teaching and be rightly placed back at the centre of understanding of revelation and redemption. Lyle argues that full emotive expression as a component of embodiment is an absolute necessity when caring with theological integrity, because God himself, in whose image humanity is created, uses the full spectrum of emotive expression. Therefore, it's crucial that the full spectrum of emotional experience as documented in the biblical narrative be respected and drawn upon. However, as Jones explains, a troubling reality for those who have experienced trauma is that it's hard to know God when your knowing faculties have been disabled. It's hard to feel divine love when your capacity to feel anything at all has been shut down. Therefore, reducing the fear of reawakening the emotions is imperative in recovery. However, understanding emotional functioning is often misunderstood in church communities. As Patterson admits, Christian thought has reflected and reinforced emotional illiteracy. As the essence of what it is to be human means feeling emotions, including pain, it is essential that these are not interpreted abstractly, but rather are felt and experienced. Whitehead emphasises that the embodied nature of emotions in theological anthropology is crucial, as this inevitably influences one's relationships and imaginative capacity. It is evident that the Christ of dualistic thinking, separating the spirit from the body, distorts one's relationship to the body and creates a sense of alienation in the pseudo-struggle for spiritual perfection. Isherwood explains, "You'll have to look again with courage and imagination at metaphysics, at the diction of word becoming flesh and hijacking wisdom at risk, and what that really requires, and at power. We'll have to engage with new questions that we never thought possible. Although denouncing that which is oppressive is important in the empowerment of woman, claiming power through embodiment is essential, and it comes through the awakening of one's senses." Moltmann Wendell explains, "The word, which became so overpowering above all in the Protestant churches, is only an accompaniment to this experience of the senses." Furthermore, in the accounts of Christ's interaction with woman, Isherwood explains, "The experience of the senses is particularly noticeable in encounters with woman, while those with men tend to remain wordy, and thus their dynamic is restricted. The issue of embodiment through awakening the senses has been an overlooked element within our Christology, yet is vital to the sense of spiritual wholeness and well-being, therefore a matter which must be addressed." Emphasising the importance of embodiment through an emphasis on the dignity of being human can transform the individual and the world around that individual by the sheer outpouring of our dunamis, as Isherwood says. Therefore, it's essential to note that embodiment is not individualistic, but rather affects one's ability to form and sustain healthy attachments. Understanding attachment theory is important in pastoral care, as it may help explain why those experiencing eating disorders have difficulties with the concept and image of God. As the attachment dynamic experienced relationally with one's parents most often impacts on one's view of God, it's relevant that women experiencing eating disorders are often perfectionistic in their idealization of the father figures in their lives. Due to the inability to live up to their own perfectionistic standards, those experiencing eating disorders often feel profound inadequacy and shame, which can significantly impact upon their perceptions of God's love for them, His availability and His dependability. Dijkstra views God concepts as a way in which one can cognitively strengthen their understanding of God's character as an archetypal attachment figure, even when faced with negative God image experiences. Negative God images of God as a patriarchal figure, at worst abandoning His Son to a cruel death on the cross, can cause insecurity and anxiety in one's relationship to God. However, when this is reframed as the suffering God on the cross, this causes a shift in perception, revealing more of God's rich personhood. This emphasises the need for an understanding of the Trinity, and in particular the community and oneness of God, Christ and the Holy Spirit. Lau therefore suggests that God's omnipotence should be perceived as a dimension of suffering and our social reality, and interpreted and perceived in terms of grace, mercy, servanthood and sacrifice. Also reveals God on the borderline between faithfulness and vulnerability. As a God image is emotion-based and develops through feelings evoked in the experiential attachment to God, and the God concept emerges through one's practices concerning God, Dijkstra suggests that renewing God concepts helps to regulate these negative experiences. Dijkstra explains that God images and God concepts are not synonymous. The God image is often one's experiential comprehension of who God is on an affective level. Moriarty and Hoffman suggest that the God concept is one's cognitive comprehension of God, which is signified as one linguistically communicates one's knowledge of God. According to Dijkstra, the God concept is not just to enable mutual interactions to take place in constant reference to the believer's way of life. Rather, it functions to provide the faith community as a whole with a means to both maintain itself over time and to test its actual life over against what is most essential to it. Dijkstra views God concepts in a way which can cognitively strengthen one's apprehension of God's character as this archetypal attachment figure, even when faced with these negative God image experiences. Negative God images often cause insecurity and anxiety in one's relationship to God. Dijkstra suggests that God concepts help to regulate these negative experiences. The disfigured image is corrected by the concepts of safety, strength, and wisdom, which are integral to the character of God. A God concept can manifest an internal calmness, or when negative, it can cause the opposite effect of insecurity and division. God concepts act as a form of language and communicate a sense of hope, security, and identification. Although concept and image are different, Morty and Hoffman believe that they form symbiotically. The God image is more emotion-based and develops through feelings evoked in this experiential attachment to God, whereas God concept emerges through what has been taught and through these linguistic practices concerning God. As a sense of embodiment and wholesome attachments are essential for flourishing, creativity, and spiritual restoration, Hunziker suggests that the pastoral care seeks to become not only a trustworthy good object to the counselee, but also a reflection, however fragmentary, of the goodness and trustworthiness of God. If negative God images can be regulated through God concepts and cause more secure patterns of attachment, one of the most important factors relevant to the discussion is the concept of non-duality. Iceland and Isherwood radically challenge the Church to reconsider the patriarchal images of God and Jesus, which has been enforced by a dualistic Christian heritage. Keating, Rohr, and Bugault have written extensively on this as part of their contemplative tradition in Christianity. They support the view that Christian practices can aid individuals in cultivating intimacy with God and provide an experiential understanding of non-duality, which is supported by the Bible. Furthermore, Isherwood and Harris emphasise that this chasm can be bridged through engaging with one another in a community through a sense of one's erotic power. They emphasise that dualistic theology rips us from ourselves and cauterises us, enfeebling our judgment, our heart, our passion. The concept of non-duality emphasises the reality of this wholeness brought into existence by the realisation of our interconnectedness. Embodiment is a relational activity. However, as Isherwood and Harris explain, the Church as a body of Christ shares in a very unstable body, a body that calls all knowledge about bodies into question. A shame from body-based comparison combined with self-loathing and a lack of self-compassion led to social isolation for almost all the interviewees who experienced eating disorders. The Church body should, in theory, offer an iconoclastic alternative. So fourth and finally, we'll consider creativity. Creativity is a significant part of the recovery for approximately 3/4 of the women who experienced eating disorders. Two important aspects of creativity are as a distraction from the eating disorder and as an expression of emotion. When imaginative capacity was inhibited, this had an effect on self-worth and was especially prevalent during the worst stages of their disorder. Furthermore, creativity was symbiotically correlated with recovery. The effects of trauma often nullify the potential for creative growth and furthermore pose challenges to the appropriateness and timing of the application of theological beliefs. The articulation of a response to traumatic suffering is therefore the persistent challenge of theological discourse. As one's freedom to respond to the grace of God can be demolished by the infliction of acute interpersonal trauma, as trauma disorientates one's sense of time and often violates one's body, Rambo describes it as a place where death haunts life and life bears death within it. By exploring and viewing the meaning of the incarnation and the resurrection through a post-traumatic lens, Rambo links therapeutic insights and biblical narratives to portray an image of the wounded, resurrected Jesus. As Moltmann explains, believing in the resurrection does not just mean assenting to a dogma and noting a historical fact. It means participating in this creative act of God. Resurrection is not a consolium opium, soothing us with the promise of a better world in the hereafter. It's the energy for a rebirth of this life. The hope doesn't point to another world, it's focused on the redemption of this one. Christ identified disciples as those who are prepared and willing and had the creative capacity to grasp the message of his metaphorical teachings. When the disciples queried why he spoke in parables, he explained that those who were not open would not understand the parable. Therefore, he compared the lack of imagination to hardened hearts which were unable to see and hear. And theologians, as artists in theory, should use their imaginative capacity prophetically to see and hear what others have yet failed to do. As individuals find refuge and safety within the sacred stories that give meaning to their lives, Christ explains such stories and the symbolic worlds they project are not like monuments that men behold, but like dwelling places. In contrast to more rigid cognitive understanding, creativity thus permits freedom and a sense of embodied practice which engages all the senses. Smith views imagination as a quasi-faculty whereby we construe the world on a pre-cognitive level, on a register that is fundamentally aesthetic, precisely because it is so closely tied to the body. The embodied practices of imagination help one to sense life in a manner which opens the door to fulfillment of the promise of God in the forthcoming redemption. The imagination is not intended as a device to escape from the present, but rather as a tool to live more fully and experience the present moment in full sensory awakening. Jones draws from Calvin's encouragement to embody the glory of God and commends using one's imaginative capacity, describing this as faithful creativity in its truest form. Creativity and imagination and the ability to think in a way which is not bound by rigidity is vital in the restoration and recovery for those experiencing eating disorders. Therefore, effective pastoral care inspired by the resurrection hope must emanate stability and non-judgmentalism to create enough safety to open the transitional space and sensitively and at the appropriate time facilitate the creative capacity of those in recovery. There is a definitive link between creativity, intimacy, love and passionate faith, which is reflected in the call to be image bearers of God. Jones quotes Calvin's well-known metaphor in the Theatre of God and comments. In making this reference, he suggests that when we look at the beauty and complexity of the vast world around us, we should be awed by the breadth and depth of God's beauty displayed within it. Glory is something that both God and the world share. God creates it, and we see it, participate in it, and hence bear it. As one is overwhelmed by awe in this experience, there is an ability to appreciate the beauty of what was once unknown. Felix explains he, Christ, is really present in the universal beauty. The love of this beauty proceeds from God dwelling in our souls and goes out to God present in the universe. Being able to sense the universal and interconnected nature of this beauty is that which motivates one to love oneself, others and God as a natural emergence of authentic connection, gratitude and love. It is through this connection, gratitude and love that there is a sense of safety wherein the imagination is accessed and creativity birthed. Barth explains that as God's children we are released from the seriousness of life and should simply play before God. As imagination produces images and provides an active and playful approach, it empowers the individual to use their imagination contemplatively. Through contemplation on the nature of God as a playful divine creator, the individual can begin to cognitively understand and effectively grasp what it means to be an image bearer of God. Van der Kolk explains that the creative playful use of the imagination and looking forward to future possibilities rather than repeatedly retelling the past is an integral part of healing from trauma. Thus, the development of creative play in the transitional space has tremendous potential for growth. It is on her to give voice to the unexpressed, to give form to what once seemed impossible. When the imaginative capacity opens, new possibilities arise. The imagination breaks through what would have been deemed impossible and can help those who have experienced trauma to view the future with the hope that they need for recovery to a full life. As a Christian imagination offers glimpses of God's promised redemption, a redemption which is available in the present, hope and new possibilities can arise, leading to a more abundant life. When transitional space is opened through the repetition of culturally relevant liturgical practices, church communities can become cultural containers to restore, hold and support. As church communities open up to interdisciplinary dialogue, books, films, poetry, theatre, art and music all potentially offer mediums by which a new identity can be created. As human consciousness mediates between the mundane and the sacred, church communities must use all the abundant resources of the tradition to provide and develop mediums by which to help individuals to find the sacred in their own mundane stories and therefore find meaning and purpose to their experiences. When one who has experienced immense trauma can, as Herman says, begin dreaming of an ordinary life, that person is ready to begin their reintegration into community. Providing a space where mundane stories can be shared without fear of retribution creates space to imagine and find meaning in the sacred, which will aid the individual who is suffering to transcend their social context and find personal meaning and identity. The creative use of the imagination and pastoral care looks forward to future possibilities and is careful to ensure that there is not a loop of stagnant retelling of the past. Imagination and creativity are essential to the cultivation of faith, otherwise biblical literalism and religious endeavour ensues and it inevitably causes rigidity and stifles the potential for flourishing. So some concluding thoughts. The findings from this research confirm that the church is certainly part of the problem when it embraces the tenets of patriarchal theology. If patriarchal traits are apparent in the church community, they're off-putting and potentially damaging to those seeking care. Significantly, many fundamentalist traits mirror the characteristics of women experiencing eating disorders. Therefore, it has been crucial to consider how these traits may deepen distress for the sufferer in pastoral encounters and provide an alternative theological perspective which has the potential to help counteract these deleterious effects. Furthermore, the passivity of relevant theologically based pastoral care literature on eating disorders has verified the need for additional future research to commence a theologically based process which could aid in recovery. Conversely, although church communities demonstrate negative factors which are not conducive to recovery, some communities which are receptive to change could have a distinctive opportunity to offer much needed stability and safety to women experiencing eating disorders and to their carers. As increasing empirical evidence proves that greater coping expectancies for those experiencing eating disorders are linked to a sense of spirituality, security, connectedness and purpose, the church community has a unique opportunity to provide a safe and loving spiritual home. The abandonment of over-intellectualization in favour of an embodied practice opens up the possibilities for the entire church community to be engaged in compassionate interpersonal relationships to help reduce crippling feelings of shame. More specifically, empowering the one who is suffering to engage with their vulnerability and realise their creative capacity can open doors to reducing fear through experiencing transcendence and all within and beyond the immediacy of the pastoral encounter. Creating an empathetic connection and thus relationality is of vital importance in recovery of those who have experienced eating disorders, which therefore means that both feminist theologians and those who adopt a more reformed position, such as Jones and Moltmann and Wendell, can reach a common ground whereby the importance is focused on the empowerment of the individual without diminishing the power of the crucifixion narrative. Therefore, although feminist theologies move away from traditional interpretations of sin and focus on the innate goodness of humanity, emphasising the importance of owning one's erotic power, the unjust and brutal nature of the crucifixion does not have to be disregarded. Rather, the true redemption narrative neither justifies victimization nor disempowerment. Rather, the emphasis is on the life of the relational Christ who suffered and died unjustly, yet defeated death in his human body, bringing a life-giving theology of the cross. As the redemptive hope of the future is in itself the happiness of the present, those experiencing eating disorders and their carers could find a place of rest free from internal and external oppression in the church community, or rather this is best described as in the body of Christ. The identification of women with eating disorders can thus be completed by an identification with the risen Christ, and this is what brings hope. If Christ is the emaciated, rejected, ugly one, and is actually the powerful one, what has been deemed vulnerable is translated into powerful because of what he actually is in himself, that being divine. Therefore, women who are or perceive themselves as ostracised from themselves, God and community can be affirmed and resurrected because of who they are, bearers of the image of God. Innocent victims can then become resurrected bearers of a new quality of life. Therefore, the promise of redemption, when embodied by the church communities, offers not a solution per se, but rather a unique hope available in this present world, inspired by an identification with Christ himself as a fellow traveller on the journey through the dark night of the soul and beyond. Thank you.